This week's episode of Sounds Good is brought to you by the folks who make my podcast happen, Gradient. They recently launched their full editorial website filled with tons of articles advancing identity and culture. Go check it out at Gradient.is. That's Gradient.is. Hello everyone, Brandon Harvey here. Welcome to this week's episode of Sounds Good, the podcast where every single Monday I sit down with an inspiring person and talk about happiness, overcoming struggles, and living a life of intentionality and adventure. This week I have Joshua DuBois on the show. Joshua is a former assistant to President Obama and became the president's friend and spiritual advisor. Often described as pastor-in-chief, he was named one of the 100 most influential African Americans in the country by The Root and Ebony magazine. He's written 4 cover stories for Newsweek and is seriously quoted in a big article for mainstream media on like a weekly basis. It's crazy. Joshua is now the founder and CEO of Values Partnerships, a consultancy that's worked with Paramount Pictures, Oprah Winfrey, The History Network, and ABC's Shark Tank. Today, Joshua and I dove into the idea of finding hope in politics, which I think is especially fitting considering how crazy politics are in the United States during this season. And I want to mention, kind of as a side note, that I was super nervous going into this conversation. I mean, I was like 1 degree of separation from the President of the United States. But as soon as Joshua started talking, his calm and kind demeanor calmed me down again. That's just kind of the guy he is. So I loved our conversation. I thought it was so great. I hope that regardless of your faith tradition or your political affiliation, you'll keep on tuning into this episode, because it's a good one. Let's jump straight into this. All right, I'm here today with Joshua DuBois. Joshua, welcome to Sounds Good.
It is great to be on with you, Brandon, and hello to the Sounds Good community.
So I just want to start off by saying the other day I was scrolling through Instagram, and I'm friends with Pete Souza, the president's photographer, and I saw him post a photo, and I was like, wait a second, I recognize this guy. And it was you and your lovely wife and your almost 1-year-old kid, August, hanging out in what I believe was the Oval Office with the president just going like goo-goo over your kid.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun, man. We, the president has played an important role in my story and in our family, and has just been a wonderful support and mentor and friend over the years. And he asked us to bring August in to hang out a little bit. And so
That's
we got
so
in there,
cute.
and he took a photo and jumped down on the carpet in the Oval with him. And August drooled on his desk a little bit, and we had a good time. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, that's so good. I heard rumors that you can attribute the president to you and your wife getting married. Is that true?
Well, yeah. So, we met, Michelle and I met when I was working in then Senator Obama's Senate office, and she was working on Capitol Hill as well. And so we actually met at something called a constituent coffee. My wife's from Chicago, and Senator Obama at the time invited his constituents to have coffee with him on Thursday mornings, and she was one of the people that came over. I remember her, one, because she was awesome and beautiful and really smart, but also because she's 5'0", and she was standing in line to meet Senator Obama, and she was standing behind Dikembe Mutombo, who was having coffee with him at the time as well, who's like, 7'3". And so it was this amazing contrast. I'm like, who's that short lady standing behind Dikembe Mutombo? And so we struck up a friendship then, and later started dating. And when we were dating for a few years, President Obama by that time pulled me to the side and said, "What is taking you so long? Why have you not proposed yet?" To make a long story short. And so, yeah, he has played a nice and helpful role, kind of creating the spaces for my wife and I to connect.
That's incredible. That's great. And you've been married how many years now?
A little bit over 2 years now. Yep.
That's great. That's so exciting. And if I back up a little bit, I understand that you decided to apply to work for Barack Obama after watching his speech at the 2004 Democratic National Convention, which it was an incredible speech, one of the best speeches I've seen from any sort of political arena. And can you tell me about that process of applying to go work for this guy?
Yeah, man, it was wild. I didn't watch the speech in person. I was actually at a restaurant, a little pub on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington D.C. I was interning in between 2 years in graduate school in New Jersey, but I was in D.C. Doing an internship. And was basically grabbing a burger and saw this speech that was on the televisions there. And it was then State Senator Barack Obama giving this amazing speech. And he was talking about all the stuff that I really believed in and bringing people together and all the policy issues that I really cared about. And then out of nowhere, he said, we worship an awesome God in the blue states. And, my faith is important to me, but I'm also kind of a progressive guy. And I thought, man, this is a Democrat who doesn't mind talking about his values. And so I just sort of got interested in him then. And wrote a bunch of letters to his Senate campaign and got a bunch of form letter responses. And, one day decided to...
Form letter responses saying no?
Yeah, saying no. I'm actually looking at one now. I keep a copy of one of the no letters in my office.
That's amazing.
Next to a photo of a meeting with the president in the Oval Office, just to be a reminder of what's possible with grace and hard work. But yeah, so I got a bunch of responses and decided one day that I would just drive down from New Jersey to D.C. and just kind of show up at his office. So I did that and didn't go that well. They were like, we've got way too many applicants and you're going to have to, not do this again, not just show up. And so I drove back to Jersey, and 2 weeks later, I said, let me give this one last shot. I really feel like I'm supposed to be there. And so I drove down again. And they arranged, when I got there, they said they were going to let me at least meet with a very senior person in the office. And so I had a conversation with somebody in then Senator Obama's office and wrapped up the conversation and drove back up to Jersey feeling pretty good. And then I Googled the guy's name and I found out he's the IT guy in the office. And that didn't go that well either. But that journey down twice gave me some leverage to email the legislative director and say, hey, listen, man, I've been down there 2 times now, basically 8 hours round trip on I-95. Is there any way I can get an interview? And he wrote me back and set up a phone call. And eventually, they allowed me to come down for an in-person interview and was hired in the office. So it was just a wonderful journey with a lot of grace and providence and, probably a little bit of annoying behavior on my part that got me in the door.
Oh, that's so good. I love people who are just total go-getters. Do you feel like you've always been that way? Have you always been like a mix between crazy and hardworking? Or was that just something that was really, really like a passion of yours where like, I want to chase after this particular thing?
It's funny. I've always been scared to death by big opportunities like that. And honestly, I'm almost frozen, but then have that last final impulse to to jump out there. It's this weird dynamic where I'm like the last person to get on an amusement park ride, or I have no desire to skydive. I mean, that's just not something. But at that last final moment, where if it's really important, I don't know how to tell myself no. I don't know how to not jump out there. And so it's kind of an interesting balance where I don't consider myself in sort of the medium scale everyday things. I don't consider myself all that much of a risk taker. But when you're sort of right at the edge of the cliff and you need to jump off and try to fly, that's the moments where for some reason I have a crazy impulse to jump out there. And sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, that's I guess that's the best way to describe it.
That's incredible. And yeah, really that time, that jump, that leap, that risk worked out.
Yeah, in this case, it was it did, and again, I don't think it was anything about me, but I think it was just more about just kind of being in the place that I was supposed to be.
Yeah, that's incredible. And a few years later, Barack Obama gets elected president, and you are 26 years old, and he taps you as somebody he wants to bring into the White House with him. I'm 23 right now. I can't imagine in 3 years having a job where I answered to the president every single morning. What was that weight of responsibility like? What did your college friends and what did your family think?
Yeah, it was definitely a significant responsibility. I didn't think too much about sort of the age thing. In fact, the the president didn't even know my age. I was intentional and almost annoying in not telling anyone my age, even when asked. And
That's
so,
smart.
it was just kind of never a factor for me. I'd always kind of been in situations where, you had to perform alongside people who, had more experience than you. And so it didn't really, come into play, other than the fact that, the president may not have known my exact birthday the entire time I was working for him, but he was very intentional about empowering young people. So, his chief speechwriter, my friend John Favreau, who worked with him on some of the most iconic speeches, in our country's history, was right around my age as well. Tommy Vitor, who does a lot of great work for him on foreign policy, or even Ben Rhodes, who's a couple years older than us, but is a really wise and careful advisor on foreign policy as well. There are a lot of good folks at the time in their late 20s and their 30s and their early 40s who, the president's bottom line was, I'm not going to give you any extra points just for being young, but I'm also not going to hold it against you. And if you can bring it, so to speak, if you can, bring the dedication, the love for your country, for people who are marginalized, if you have good ideas and you take the time to vet them and to let the best ones bubble to the top, then I'm going to give you a shot. And so that's the one way it did play in, is the fact that this is a president who really does not let age become a barrier for him in finding people who can do their jobs.
That's incredible. And yeah, I think that just pays off for the president. He's getting people who are great, who are trusted, who feel appreciated, and you did a wonderful job at your job. So that's great. So you're working closely with the person with the most scrutinized job in the entire world. What is it kind of like to deal with that kind of pressure? And is there a weight of responsibility in having a role that's pretty important to the president?
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a tremendous amount of scrutiny on the president and everyone that works for him. You really have to do your best to just do your job and realize that sometimes people are going to like that job. Sometimes people are going to hate that job. Sometimes people are going to know what you're doing. You have to have kind of a tunnel vision to some extent of, what's most important. Who are the people you're supposed to serve this day? What are the accomplishments, the goals that you've set for yourself this day, this week, this month, this year? And then if you lay it all on the field every day, and if you can look yourself in the mirror at night and say, I poured as much into this as I can, then you're okay if people love it or if they hate it or if they're neutral, because that you've done your best. It sounds a little cliche, but I mean, really, approaching each day with a finish line in mind. And if you cross your own personal finish line, whether that's operating with integrity or, serving people in the way that you want to serve them, then, at least for me, and I think this is the case for the president as well, you're okay if sometimes people don't like that, or sometimes, they disagree with you, because, that you have done your absolute best to fulfill your own responsibility. So that's kind of the way, we try to approach things.
Absolutely. And I guess if you're always creating, or if you're always doing things to appease the critic, then you're never going to really be successful. It works much better to work to appease the people that like and appreciate what you're doing. And of course, you want to take constructive criticism into account, but at the end of the day, it doesn't do you any good to focus on the critics. So I like what you said about tunnel vision. I think that's really valuable. So for those who don't know about what you do, every single morning you send a snippet of scripture to the president in the form of a devotional, kind of almost like a morning pep talk or morning wisdom. And you actually published a book on it, and I loved it. I read through the whole thing. And your book includes a whole lot of emphasis on teachings and advice on how to love others, but especially how to love your enemies. Why did you think that this idea of loving your enemies was such an important idea for the president?
Well, I think it's important for the president for the same reason I think it's important for everyone, because in the final account, our enemies in a lot of cases aren't really our enemies. They're people with whom we share a common humanity. Oftentimes, they're people who have similar hopes and dreams, and if we can find those points of commonality, I think the world would be a whole lot better place, and we'd get a lot more done. And so that's really one of the reasons I've focused on it, was to sort of deconstruct the notion of who an enemy is in the first place.
Absolutely.
But also, sometimes there are going to be people who just purely disagree with you. And I think, everyone can get along well with people that get along well with them, right? It's not a difficult thing to not scream at a good driver. It's a difficult thing to not scream at a bad driver on the road. It's not a test of character or integrity or strength to not get angry at your spouse or your brother or your sister or your partner or the people that are close to you or your coworker when they're making you happy. That's not hard. The real challenge is what happens when we're stretched to our breaking point, when people are doing something that we genuinely think is wrong or misguided. How do we navigate that conflict? How do we navigate that tension? And I think that's really where where you can really make progress just as a person, is learning to navigate those places of tension. And so I tried to focus on that, both for the president, but also just for myself and hopefully for others who now have read some of these devotionals.
That's incredible. I think that's absolutely important. And I really admire what you said about it's not a testament to your ability to love people if you're just loving your friends or just loving your spouse. It's much more of a testament to your ability to love people when you love somebody who is either opposite of you or very anti you,
Yep.
I think that's great. Yeah. And so I read through this whole book, and it's really fun being okay, cool. These are things that Joshua sent to the president's BlackBerry every single morning. In the process of doing this, did the president ever give you topics where he's hey, I would really love for you to send me some stuff focused on this. I'm dealing with X and Y every day. Can you offer me A and B? Was there anything like that?
Yeah, I don't know that it was as kind of micro-targeted as that, but he would definitely provide his reaction at some points, or say, I like that, and I like the message today or yesterday. There was one time early on, so I started sending these on the campaign and then continued in the White House, and there were a couple months where I didn't receive a whole lot of feedback, so I thought, maybe he's not reading these things, and I'll take a little break, I'll take a couple weeks off and then restart. And I get a call from Reggie Love, who at the time was his body man. And he's sitting in the outer oval, and he's hold for a phone call from the Oval, and I answer the phone, and it's Reggie, and he's the president's wondering where his devotionals are. So that was kind of cool to see that he was actually reading them, but also a little embarrassing as well.
Yeah, you got busted.
Yeah. So, I try to focus in on topics that I know are of interest to him. I talk about jazz a fair amount because he's a big music buff and a jazz fan. I talk about history a lot because he's a history buff, and try to distill some lessons from previous presidents, and then weaving in scripture throughout. So yeah, those are some of the areas of focus.
Man, that's so fascinating. I think that a lot of people would say that working with the president would be really, really cool. But obviously, in any president's tenure, there's some really horrible moments. Bush had 9/11, Clinton had Columbine, and the president has said, Barack Obama has said, that the darkest moment in his presidency was the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in 2012. I think that the story of what you guys did in response to that was a really humanizing and powerful story. Would you mind sharing a little bit about what you guys did and what that experience was like?
Yeah, and I should say at the outset that first off, I didn't do much of anything other than just kind of be there and be with the president in that time. And the second thing I should say is that no matter what he did, and I thought it was really important, it still pales in comparison to the tragedy that those families faced then, and the stuff they're still probably going, and I'm sure they're going through right now with the loss
Absolutely.
of 20 kids, babies, elementary school students, and then 6 teachers and staff as well. I mean, it just kind of boggles the mind when you think about it. I'm happy to read just a little bit of an excerpt from the book. This is from the essay that begins the May devotionals, and it's called "Done in Secret." Starts off, the White House is not supposed to be a place for brokenness, just sheer shattered brokenness. But that's what we experienced on the weekend of December 14th, 2012. I talk a little bit in the essay about how I was sitting at my desk when we got the news that there was a gunman in a school, and I was just incredulous. I thought that there's no way this could be the case. But then the facts came in, and you realize 20 children killed, 6 staff, and it was just, terrible. And that news sort of began a weekend of numbness, and I kind of shook out of it on Saturday when I got word that the president wanted me to accompany him to Newtown. He wanted to meet with the families of the victims and then offer words of comfort to the country at a memorial service. I of course, said yes, left early to help the advance team sort of set up spaces for the families to gather behind the scenes. We didn't know what to do, but basically assembled a few classrooms, put tissues and water in each classroom, and there would be 2 or 3 families in each room. The families sort of gathered together. They were trying to be as respectful as possible of the president coming in, but you could tell they were just completely shaken, and it's so understandable. It barely needs to be said. Went downstairs when the president came in, and went downstairs to greet him, and I provided him an overview of the situation. It's basically, sir, there are 2 families per classroom, and the first family is, and I tell him that family's name, that their child was, I tell him the deceased child's name, and the second family is, and so on. He sort of took a deep breath and steeled himself and went into the first classroom. And as I wrote, what happened next, I will never forget. Person after person received this engulfing hug from the commander-in-chief. He'd look him in the eyes and say, "Tell me about your son. Tell me about your daughter." And then would sort of hold up pictures of the ones that we'd lost, as the parents would describe their favorite food and their television shows that they liked, or even the sound of their laughter. And then there were younger siblings there, maybe 2 or 3 years old, who were too young to really understand what was going on. And the president would try to sort of get them to laugh a little bit. He'd grab them and toss them up into the air, or hand them a box of White House M&Ms that he had in his pocket. And, it's just a really touching moment. And, in each room I saw his eyes water, but he never broke down. And then the scene would just sort of repeat itself over and over again. He'd move through, almost 100 relatives, and everyone received personal attention, hugs, looks directly in the eye, support, prayer, whatever they needed. And just remember thinking that this has got to be taking a toll on this guy. And of course, and I note this as well, that this is, whatever comfort he was able to provide is, completely inadequate in the face of this particular loss. But it was just a small measure of love on that weekend. And then, the point that I make at the end of the essay is that, as I mentioned before, President Obama has never really spoken about these meetings. He talked about gun violence. He talked about the policy issues, but he kept this to himself. And, I know lots of different faith traditions out there. And in my tradition, Jesus teaches us that some things, the holiest things, the most painful and important things we're supposed to do in secret, not for public consumption or display, but as service to others and worship to God. And then, the teaching that I believe is that God, who sees what is done in secret, will reward us, maybe not now, but certainly in eternity. And that was one of the lessons that I learned from the president. And the most important moments that we will have, and that show our character most, the most important moments we'll have on this earth, are not when the cameras are on and when you're in front of people, but really in the way that you treat people in private and in secret, when no one's looking, and when you're not trying to teach a lesson or get some credit or anything like that. The president's never really talked about those meetings, and it's I think it's a place where his character really shone through.
That is so powerful. That's so incredible. Yeah, and I think that the most admirable thing in that is that this was something that was done in secret. I would love it if every single guest I have on this podcast, people who are people of influence, people of power, instead of talking about their greatest accomplishments, they kept their greatest accomplishments to themselves and let those things be more impactful because they were just done out of a decision to make an impact, not because they needed the bragging rights or anything.
Yeah. My pastor, Mark Batson, always says, I don't need to be famous in the world. I want to be famous in my own home. And I love that notion that he also says, I want the people who know me the best to respect me the most. And I just think that's such a powerful idea that that's when you know that you've made it, when the people who are closest to you that know you the best respect you the most.
That's the ultimate goal. That was a little bit of a heavy topic, but I'm really glad that we got to jump into that because I think that's such a powerful and humanizing and intimate story. I want to ask, you worked in the trenches of the White House for years. You're still in the heart of D.C. right now in the world of politics. I think it's a really frustrating and hard place for a lot of people. I think a lot of people are just a little bit overwhelmed by the current political climate. What kind of wisdom can you offer people for, keeping a hopeful approach to what's happening in politics right now? And maybe you could even talk a little bit about what's being done behind closed doors, the hopeful things that are happening behind closed doors.
Yeah. I would say the first thing that hopefully will encourage people is that I truly believe the American people are so much better than American politics right now. There are certain exceptions to this, but for the most part, we're a country full of really good-hearted people who love their families and they're trying to do right by their community and, trying to have an impact on the world. And you don't always see that reflected on cable news or on Twitter, but that's the case. And I think we've got to remind ourselves of that and let that encourage us that no matter what background or race or ethnicity or perspective folks are coming from, that is in fact the case. And so I would say that's the first thing. The second thing is, I would really focus on the issues. Yes, our politics are kind of broken right now, and happy to speak about particular candidates that concern me. But there are also some really important underlying issues that are up for debate. How are we going to stop human trafficking in this country and around the world? How are we going to reform our criminal justice system and give people who have been locked up a second chance and have more equitable criminal justice policies in the first place? How are we going to protect our environment, man? And, make sure that my baby son at 8 months old has a planet that he can breathe and live in the context of climate change. These are not Republican issues or Democratic issues. These are not liberal or conservative issues. They're just tough challenges that creative people of goodwill can really solve. And so I would really kind of focus in on those issues. I do think it's important, for those who are so inclined to not give up on engagement in politics in the public square. There's a lot at stake, particularly right now. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But even if you're not gung-ho about, particular candidates, really kind of honing in on what issues are important to you, to this generation and the next generation, is, I think, an important lens. And remembering that, again, the American people are better than American politics, and that, there are a lot of good folks in this country still.
Yeah, I think that's incredible. And I think that as soon as you kind of identify core issues that you care more about than, core parties or anything like that, then it gives you the opportunity to actually do something about it. If all I care about is voting Republican or voting Democrat, then, if I don't like the candidate, I can't do anything about it. But if what I actually care about is, the environment, or what I actually care about is, criminal justice or human trafficking, those are things that, even if I am not able to vote for a presidential candidate that aligns with me perfectly, I can actually go out and I can make an impact by loving my neighbor, by spending time with people in my community. Like that, you can get really hands-on with that. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, I agree.
And on that same note, how do you keep a positive perspective? Not necessarily specifically with politics, but just when you're inundated with something that feels over your head, what have you found works well for keeping a positive perspective on a more general note?
Yeah, Again, we all come from different backgrounds and belief sets, and a lot of that for me is grounded in my faith, and in the way I see the world through that lens. And I realize that as important as what's happening right in front of me, that my worth and my value lies somewhere that's bigger than myself, right? And so that's I think an important piece for me. So no matter what happens on a day-to-day basis, I'm not bummed out. I definitely get bummed out from time to time, but it's I realize that there's something broader on the horizon, and so I think that's an important piece for me. I think in addition to that, it really is the power of the human spirit. It sounds almost cliche, but again, you get out into the world, and Brendan, you know this, man. You've been all over the world interacting with some amazing, phenomenal people, telling their story through pictures and words, and you realize that, man, every person is just has something so unique and special about them. So they're fearfully and wonderfully made. They are just kind of shaped in this in this really unique way. And it's almost like a treasure hunt, starting each day trying to figure out what's good around you, and it may not be right on the surface, but if you dig a little deeper inside people and in communities, you're going to find something. And so really having that spirit of curiosity, of wonder, and going out and finding what's beautiful in the world is, I think, a cure for the doldrums, and for the things that get us down.
Having a spirit of curiosity and wonder. That's my ultimate goal every day, and I'm so glad that you put it that way. Okay, so at the end of my show every week, I love to ask a few specific questions to every single guest. And at this point, we're a few months into this, and I want to evolve this a little bit. And so I'm going to tweak these a little bit to be a little bit more catered to you. So my first question is, there's a lot of negativity around politics right now. And I more so want to ask, what do you admire about the political system? Where do you see good in the actual system? Because I think, like we said before, it would get really easy to be okay, let's just throw it all away. Let's not pay any attention to it. But as an insider, what do you see?
Yeah, I admire that we have a pretty open and pretty free and pretty fair political system, even if we don't like the outcomes all the time. And there are some issues with that. I'm really concerned about restrictions on voting rights and voter ID that are particularly impacting minority populations. But generally, we're not living in an authoritarian government where reporters are being arrested and minority political parties and leaders are being put in jail just because of their beliefs. And so I admire that even when I don't like the outcomes, and even though I'm increasingly concerned about voting rights, by and large, we still have a pretty open and pretty fair political infrastructure in this country. Again, I have to underscore that there are some problems. There are absolutely some problems, but we're not living in Eastern Europe under communism, or in China, or in other places that are more restrictive. And I think that's something to be thankful for.
That's a really good way to see that, and I think that it's really great that you're able to have that perspective from within the system rather than me being an outsider looking in. So thank you for that. My next question that I normally ask is, what are you consuming right now? What are you watching? What are you listening to? But I more so just want to know,
Kimmy Schmidt.
If you I love Kimmy Schmidt. Along those lines, though, Scandal, Veep, West Wing, or House of Cards, which are you more likely to sit down and binge watch?
I love Kerry Washington. She's a wonderful person, and we've done had different interactions over the years. Scandal has gotten a little bit out there for me right now, and so
it's ridiculous at this point.
I could say the same thing about the second season of House of Cards, although I think it came back with a bang in this past season, so that was solid. I've never seen an episode of The West Wing, which is appalling to everyone that I know in Washington. So it's so I couldn't make that comparison. But I am absolutely unlikely to be watching anything related to politics when I go home. I am. I'm a nerd, man. My wife is so appalled by the fact that I will watch hours of Antiques Roadshow. There's some ways that I'm a typical millennial, and some ways that I am not, man. You put me in front of HGTV, Antiques Roadshow. Isn't that insane?
My
yeah, it's
gosh.
kind of embarrassing. But now I've told the world, so it is what it is.
That's so good. Everybody has to tweet Joshua about that and embarrass him because that's fantastic.
Now I regret it. Now I regret having shared. I'm just kidding. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we're keeping that in the show for sure. My last question for you is, based on the ways you've chosen to step out and live your life differently, what's one thing you'd encourage someone else to do in their own life? So whether it's part of your journey of how you got to where you are and the ways that you've lived into what you do, or what you've seen with the president, what's something you'd encourage someone to do in their own life today?
Stay humble and hustle hard. It sounds like a t-shirt slogan, which it probably is somewhere, but it's really those two sides of that coin. And remember that you don't know everything, that you need the wisdom of other people, that there's a much bigger world than you, and let that humility settle down deep in your bones. I think that is so important, to start with humility, but then get out there and go for it. Do the work. Once you're grounded in humility, just to take those leaps, and that I think the heavens will open when we jump out there. But it's important before you do that, before you try to shoot for the stars, to understand, your own humanity, and to approach life with a spirit of humility, and then jump out there, and beautiful things are going to happen.
Humility and hustle. That is fantastic. That's a perfect way to wrap up this episode. Joshua, if people want to find out more about you, follow along with your baby pictures, or find out about your book, where can they find you?
So the book is The President's Devotional, and it's on Amazon and other places where books are sold, in Barnes & Noble and so forth. You can find me on Twitter at Joshua DuBois. My Instagram is Hey DuBois, Hey DuBois, like hello, Hey DuBois. But it's mostly baby pictures. More substantive stuff comes on Twitter. My website is just joshuadubois.com, and I don't have a Snapchat, which my little sister is very pleased with the fact that I do not have a Snapchat. So
I'll talk you into getting a Snapchat one of these days.
Absolutely.
Dude, well, thank you so much, Joshua, for being on the show. I think that you have given me an incredible perspective on politics through the years, and I have no doubt that everything you shared today is going to really resonate with people.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the work that you're doing in the world, man. You are stitching people across the globe together in a way that's really making us a little bit more healthy, a little bit more whole. And I really appreciate this podcast and all your listeners and your work yourself, Brandon. So thanks, man.
That means a lot, man. Keep being awesome.
All right, talk to you later.
Sounds Good with Brandon Harvey is part of the Gradient Podcast Network and is created in collaboration between me, Brandon Harvey, and Gradient. Find them on Facebook and Twitter at Gradient.is. That's Gradient, DOTIS. Thanks so much for tuning into this week's episode. If you enjoyed the conversation, make sure you subscribe so that new conversations with incredible people pop up on your phone as soon as they're live. If you want to tweet, Instagram, or Snapchat me, feel free to reach out at Brandon Harvey. That's Brandon with an EN. And you can learn more about me and sign up for my good newsletter at brandonharvey.com. The newsletter is actually getting a facelift this week. It's going to look really, really sexy. So that sounds so stupid to describe a newsletter that way, but it's going to look so good. And of course, it'll be filled with hopeful news stories from around the world. So seriously, go sign up right now. And that's it for this week's episode. See you next week when we get the opportunity to learn from another incredible person. Sound good?